Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kevin Delano. I'm a geologist at the State Water Resources Control Board in the in-stream flow unit in the Division of Water Rights. And today's webinar is titled Ventura River Watershed Groundwater Surface Water Model Scenarios Methodology Webinar. And I'm joined today by my colleagues on our modeling project team from the State Water Board, as well as from the non-point source and TMDL unit at the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, and our modeling team at Geosyntech Consultants and DBSNA. I've got contact info included up here for all water board staff if you want to follow up with us at any point. And I just want to acknowledge that though you'll mostly be hearing from Al Preston from Geosyntech and myself today, there's a lot of people that work on this project. So if this seems familiar, it's because it is. We're using a pretty similar format to the May webinars that we did. So at the start of this meeting, all non-host participants don't have permission to unmute or turn on their video. But during presentations, we'll have breaks for questions. And so to ask a question, you can type it in the chat. Or you can say in the chat, hey, I'd like to unmute and ask a question, or you can just use the little raise hand feature at the bottom center of your Zoom screen, and we'll see your hand go up and we'll put you in the list. So my colleague Shahab is keeping track of everyone that's asking questions, and we'll just answer them in the order that they come in. We have lots of time for discussion today. We have a 3-hour time slot, and so we have lots and lots of time for discussion, and we hope to use that. So our pauses for questions will be longer than they have in previous webinars. And as before, with spring webinars, the instructions for accessing these slides, the chat log here for Zoom, and the meeting recording, which will be posted on YouTube, those instructions for accessing these resources will be posted at the end of there's a slide at the end that has that information. And if you miss that, if you get disconnected or you have to leave, just email me or any of my colleagues, and we'll send you that login information. It is the same as it was for the previous webinars. So here's today's outline. We'll wrap up this introduction and immediately go into talking about scenarios. The first part of the presentation will be discussing the 4 scenarios that we have, that we know we want to run, that we want to build and evaluate with the groundwater surface water model of the Ventura River Watershed, which I also refer to as the GS flow model. We'll break, we'll come back and we'll have a discussion about the about options for the 4 to be determined scenarios. And then we have more time at the end to follow up with any questions that we didn't resolve earlier or that people want to talk about more. And then at the end of today's presentation, we'll just review our project timeline for the next 6 months and do a wrap up. So here's kind of a purpose of today's webinar. So back when we published our final study plan in 2019, we announced that we would use a memo. We would publish a draft memo to give the Ventura watershed community and the technical advisory committee the opportunity to review our methodology for running scenarios, and that we would solicit comments on that methodology. And we've turned that memo into a webinar. So we're still soliciting comments and we're soliciting data, but the format is different. And so we have scope and budget for the modeling team to evaluate 8 GS flow scenarios. So 8 scenarios with the groundwater surface water model. These scenarios are honestly just the starting point for what can be evaluated with this groundwater surface water model. I almost think of them as seed ideas to lead to future conversations about what scenarios people want to evaluate, or future iterations of scenarios, tweaks to the ones that we start with. So more scenarios can be evaluated, and I know will be evaluated later by both the State Water Board, but also any other parties that decide to use this model. So this webinar today, like I mentioned, has 2 purposes. The first is to solicit comments on the methodology for 4 selected GS flow scenarios. Those 4 scenarios that we know we're going to evaluate are unimpaired flow, climate change, Mesa Dam Removal, and post-Thomas Fire recalibration of the groundwater surface water model. The second part of today's webinar is a little more open-ended, and we want to solicit comments and data on what the remaining 4 scenarios that we will evaluate will be. We are soliciting comments and data through Friday, December 3rd, and you can email that information to instreamflows@waterboards.ca.gov. That being said, if there's a couple of scenarios in particular that are going to require, if we are able to build them, are going to require a bit of coordination with the parties that we're asking for data from. So if this might be this, hopefully this is the start of 2 to 3 months of coordination between parties that want to help us build scenarios and provide data. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the first scenario, which is unimpaired flow. So unimpaired flow has a lot of controversy behind it, or maybe people have a lot of impressions of it. So we want to define what the unimpaired flow scenario is and is not. The purpose of the unimpaired flow scenario is to create a bookend scenario where we have a water budget. And specifically, we're going to create a water budget for water years 1994 to 2017. And we want to understand the quantity and timing of stream flow and groundwater that is available in the watershed that can be used for both reasonable human and ecosystem beneficial uses. So we're not trying to recreate pre-development conditions in the Ventura River watershed. We're not trying to remove, well, I'll just leave it there. So the purpose of the scenario is to understand how much water exists in the watershed before it is used by people. So I'll get into how the unimpaired flow scenario works. So with all these scenarios, first I'll tell you what the purpose of it is, and then I'll describe how the scenario is set up in the model. And if you want to have a kind of a deeper technical dive into, let's say, like what model packages will be changed, or specifically like what parameters will be changed, we can do that here or offline. So with the draft unimpaired flow scenario, all diversions from surface water and all pumping from groundwater are set to 0. So there's no human water use in the watershed. For surface water diversions, this means that we remove reservoirs, and that sounds scary, and that sounds like, trying to go back to some kind of pre-development condition, and that's not the case. Reservoirs are appropriate for water rights. They're surface water rights that store water and use it later in the year or later in future years. So for an unimpaired flow scenario, we set reservoirs to 0 storage, 0 evaporation, 0 leakage, and water just flows through them as if there is no impediment. And with groundwater pumping set to 0, vegetation only receives water from precipitation and what it can pull out of the soil. So irrigation is removed, is set to 0, but all existing land use is kept in the model. So where there are crops stay. Where there is natural or domestic vegetation, that stays as well, but it only receives water from precipitation and what it can pull out of the soil. This scenario also removes any water contributions from on-site wastewater treatment plants, on-site wastewater treatment systems, OTS, and inflow from wastewater treatment plants. All other water infrastructure is consistent with existing conditions, so we keep all other kind of physical changes to the watershed. So that means that levees, channelization, and perviousness is all kept. And that is important because these features all affect how rainfall runs off versus infiltrates into the groundwater, how floodplains are connected. And so we're keeping all of those other changes to the watershed. Additionally, land use, as I mentioned earlier, is consistent with existing conditions. So all agricultural, municipal, industrial, et cetera, land use is kept. Existing vegetation is all kept, and like I said, vegetation only uses the water it gets from rain and what it can pull out of the soil. This diagram on the right, this figure just shows the work that Geosyntec did to create this scenario. So in the base case, the calibration period, in the normal version of the model, Lake Casitas is represented as a lake. But for this scenario, we had to route stream flow through the bathymetry below the lake. And so Geosyntec had to go in and remove the dam and create a stream flow routing network below Lake Casitas. And this was also done for Matilha Dam as well. And there's a figure showing what that looks like a little later. So that's it. That's the description of the unimpaired flow scenario. We have run this scenario already, and we published some preliminary draft results for the unimpaired flow scenario back in August with our preliminary draft groundwater surface water model. But we want to give you all the opportunity to comment on the methodology, and we can change it before we release the next version of the results. So does anyone have any questions? I see a hand raised.
Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Tom Hicks, have there been many people who have been previously weighing in with any substantive comment on the methodologies used to date?
No. We've had a few emails here or there over the years where someone suggests we should do X scenario or Y. Or I should say, we've had a few comments on some of the scenarios that we've that we're talking about. Obviously, if for those that aren't aware, Tom and I have talked extensively about doing a local cooperative agreement scenario, and we'll be getting to that a little later in the talk today. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, just ultimately, like the methodologies, these are really technical topics, and I know even as an attorney, I wouldn't be fully qualified to evaluate the inner workings of the scenarios you're talking about.
Okay. Well, we also welcome less technical comments if folks have them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, feel free to think about it, and we can always come back to it. Thank you, Tom, for the question. So our next scenario is our draft climate change scenario. And this one we have the most number of slides on because it's pretty complicated to, well, I basically have to explain the climate change background. So for this climate change scenario, I'm going to spend a few slides talking about projected changes in Ventura County climate and summarizing a report that was done for Ventura County, and then I'll be handing it off to Al Preston, who will talk about how we are modifying our, okay, so I'm gonna go back up because we got a question on unimpaired flow. So for unimpaired flow scenario, how are you supplanting the Lake Casitas urban water deliveries? So with the unimpaired flow scenario, there is no human water use. So all diversions, all groundwater pumping is set to 0. And then we make these other changes, and then we run the scenario to see how do surface water levels and groundwater levels change if there's no human water use in the watershed, if there's no storage in reservoirs, things like that. So we wouldn't be replacing, we wouldn't be finding alternative sources of water from, for example, from those that receive water from Lake Casitas, because there's just no human use of water in this scenario. And that's because it's a bookend. It's just to create a water budget where we can understand how much water exists in the watershed under existing conditions, and then from there, how can that water be used for both human and ecosystem reasonable beneficial uses? Are you going to discuss the results of the scenarios? No, the only scenario that we have run is the preliminary draft unimpaired flow scenario. All other scenarios that we're talking about today have not been built or run yet. We do have preliminary draft results for this unimpaired flow scenario that were published in August, and there'll be a revised version of that coming out in December. But no, all other scenarios aren't built yet. So that's why we're doing this webinar. We want to get comments on the methodology that we're using before we run the scenarios. Any other questions? I'll wait just a second here and give people time to maybe write more. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So thank you for these questions. Yeah, please keep them coming. Okay, so climate change. So the second of our 4 scenarios that we know we're going to run, and we are soliciting comments on, is climate change. So the question here is, how would water years 1994 to 2017 have been different with climate change superimposed on top of them? So this is water years 1994 to 2017 is kind of the lived experience for the watershed, for the community, for the TAC. And we want to look at how those past years would have been different. How would have surface water levels, groundwater levels been different? How would water supplies have been different with the stressors of climate change layered on top? So to develop this scenario, we talked to Ben Hatchett, who's a co-author of the 2019 report, Projected Changes in Ventura County Climate. This was a really great resource that we could refer to, and this project was done by the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada, the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, the Watersheds Coalition of Ventura County, the Ventura River Watershed Council all played roles in making this project happen. Okay, so for this report, and I apologize if there's others that I left off. So for this report, the authors took 32 global climate models and they downscaled them to Ventura County. And then they ran those 32 global climate models to generate 32 climate projections for Ventura County. So these climate projections vary in terms of how much air temperature increase they think will happen, or they project will happen. And these 32 climate projections also vary in terms of how much precipitation is expected to increase or decrease, or how the timing of precipitation will change. All 32 scenarios used what's called the RCP 8.5. That's the business as usual pathway. This is kind of a projected pathway for climate change for the entire planet that the authors thought that we're on right now and didn't seem to be changing. So if, it's business as usual. There are better pathways where humans take a more proactive approach to reduce CO2 emissions, and there are even worse pathways where humans burn more CO2. But they took this business as usual pathway that they thought was the most likely to occur. So for the 32 climate projections, these projections were run for 2021 to 2040. And then for each projection, they compared how air temperature and precipitation changes relative to a baseline, which was for them 1950 to 2006. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here. So to confirm, you have not run the 3 other plan scenarios: climate change, dam removal, Thomas Fire. No, we have not run any other scenarios. Do you have a timeline for draft results for those scenarios? We do not. Okay, so we keep going.
Excuse me, Kevin, the question continues with, do you have a timeline for when Geosynthec will have draft results for those scenarios?
We don't quite. I don't think we're prepared to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you though. How do these projections compare to the climate change factors the state has recommended for use in Sigma? That is a good question. I will come back to that. I believe the Department of Water Resources has guidance that if you are going to evaluate climate change for Sigma, I believe it's something along the lines of like, look at these 10 climate projections. If you can't do all 10, look at these 4. And I think we picked one of like the 4, but we only picked one of the 32 projections that we will be using for our model, but we tried to be consistent with what is recommended. Okay. So for air temperature, these 32 climate models predict that temperature in the Ventura River watershed will increase. They're unanimous in that temperature will increase, and the play between the different scenarios is how much will temperature increase. For our scenario, we decided to pick a 75th percentile temperature increase, which is about a little over 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 20 years. That's on average. So this means that 75% of these 32 climate models predicted less temperature increase, but 25% of the models predicted a greater temperature increase. So we wanted to go with a conservatively bad temperature increase outcome. And the authors supported this decision, the authors of the climate change report. And so we're looking at a net increase in temperature over the baseline period for the next 20 years, which we are in the first year of now. So a little bit more about what this looks like. So the report ran 32 climate projections, I'll come back to this question in a minute. I want to get through the slide. So the authors ran 32 climate projections, and they plotted changes in max temperature for Ventura County, and they found that max temperature will increase in all seasons and will increase the most in summer, and especially in inland areas such as where the city of Ojai is here. But temperature increases are expected to occur in all seasons. To get a sense of what the 75th percentile looks like, you can look at this middle row, and these are boxed and whisker plots for all 32 model global climate model runs for Ventura County. And the 75th percentile is the horizontal line at the top of each box. And so, for example, in the summer in Ventura, the 75th percentile for the max change in temperature is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And in Ojai, it's about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So we will see temperature increases in all seasons, as these top horizontal lines of each box and whisker plot show, with summer being the highest. So I'll pause there for questions on air temperature, and I'll answer this question from Randall Hansen. Will climate change projections be rerun because the RCP 8.5 scenario used the 30-year period 1976 to 2005, did not capture the recent drought in the climate and CO2 conditions, so they underestimate drought. That's more of a question for the authors of this climate report. We're leaning on them and their expertise on climate change to inform the changes in air temperature and precipitation that we're going to represent in our scenario.
Hey, Kevin, this is Al. I'll just chime in here.
Yeah.
I think in a couple of slides I'll go through a little more detail, but we actually, I think we do capture the drought because we're modifying the model hydrology, so the 1994 through 2017 period, based on information from the climate model. So we're going to actually rerun that drought period, but with changed hydrology, which we increase temperature, and as you'll see in a couple of slides, probably decreased precipitation. So I think we're capturing that, if I understand your correction correctly. And I think that'll become a little more obvious in a few slides.
Thanks, Al. Any follow-up questions from Brian or from Randall or anyone else? Do temperature models make any linkage or correlation to the range of localized ETC and water demand needs? Al, is this something that you Should we just hold this question until we get to a couple slides from now?
Yeah, ET is in it. Maybe we just hold it.
Okay,
I think it'll be answered soon.
good questions. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to switch from temperature to precipitation. So the other, so the 32 global climate models predicted a wide range of potential changes in the average annual precipitation that will fall in Ventura County. And the median prediction, so this is different than air temperature. The models all predicted an increase in air temperature, and there was kind of the discrepancy between the models, or the difference in results was just how much will air temperature increase. By contrast, these models, some of them predict more precipitation, some predict less each year. But the median prediction from all 32 models, excuse me, was that there will be additional rain in the winter season, about 1 inch more on average, with slight drying, less than 0.5 inches in other seasons. So basically the median prediction is that winters get a little more wet, the rest of the seasons get a little more dry. Most importantly, the biggest change, I should say, in precipitation is that the variability of when rain comes will increase. So we're looking at more extreme events, wetter wets and drier dries. It's a kind of a simple way to think about it. But that means that overall, the models predict that there will be less wet days each year. But those days that are wet will be wetter. So there'll be increased rainfall intensity on those fewer wet days. And if there's less wet days, then there are more dry days. So that's, that's the change in variability. So we'll get into both this amount of precipitation and also the variability next. So this first row, these maps, again, of Ventura County, with Ventura Watershed being in the lower left with these 3 blue lines, show that in the winter, we're going to see an increase in precipitation. The median of all 32 global climate models predicts in Western Ventura County, maybe in the headwaters above the Ventura Watershed, we'll see a slight increase in precipitation of 1 to 2 inches per year. The spring and fall will be slightly drier in Ventura County, and the summer will have no change in precipitation, I presume because it already doesn't really rain in the summer. So this just kind of corresponds to what I said earlier. Winter is slightly more wet, the rest of the season slightly drier. And you can see that again on the box and whisker plots for the winter, especially, that the median for each of these locations, Ventura, Sulphur Mountain, Ojai, is just above the 0. So we were looking at maybe 1 inch change of precipitation in areas of the Ventura River watershed, but overall the median is about 1 inch in the watershed. There's a question, MAM equals medium of all models. What is the DJF, SON, and JJA? That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. I'd have to look back at the model report.
That's just the months that they define their seasons. December, January, February. Yeah.
December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. Thank you all. Good question. Okay, so the biggest change with precipitation forecasted from these 32 global climate models is that the variability of rain will increase. These box and whisker plots and these maps show the changes that just the top 5% of wettest days will contribute to total annual precipitation. And what the authors found, if you look at the box and whisker plots first, is that the top 5% wettest days will overall contribute 10% more, 10% more rain each year. So we're looking at the wettest days contributing more rain, and then this middle map with all the brown on it shows that the bottom 10th percentile of the top 5 wettest days are actually going to contribute even less rain. So it's kind of confusing because the authors plotted the top 10th percentile and the bottom 10th percentile of the top 5% wettest days. So just think of it as like the top 5% wettest days, and then those are broken out into which of those days will get wetter, which of those days will get drier. And they basically found that, so just for example, a storm that might have been a 5-inch storm that would have brought 5 inches of precipitation would increase, would get wetter, and would say now be a 5.5-inch storm. And by contrast, a storm that would have been a 1/10 or a 1/4 of an inch might disappear entirely or get smaller. And so yeah, we're seeing the rainfall get concentrated into a fewer number of days with higher intensity. So just to wrap up the story on precipitation, go to the next slide. And what we see is a change in the number of dry days each year, an increase in the number of dry days each year. In the Ventura River watershed, the median change in the average annual number of dry days is somewhere around 2 to 6 or 7 more dry days per year. And the higher percentiles actually show even more dry days each year. So this kind of really brings home to me that there's just, the rain is going to be smashed into smaller days, and those storms will be more intense. So that's the end of my kind of summary of this Ventura kind of climate change report, which thank you for your patience as we went through it, because it informs how we built our one climate change scenario. So I'm going to hand it over to Al, who will talk about how we used all this climate info, all these scenario results to build our scenario.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. So this is a plot that actually Dr. Ben Hatchett produced for us. We're very grateful to him for doing it. It looks at results of 32 different climate models, downscaled on average specifically to the Ventura River watershed. That's one of the reasons we wanted to use this approach, is because we can really, with Ben's cooperation, dig in and get the results we need to modify our model. So it's a scatter plot. On the vertical axis, it shows the change in median annual precipitation. You can see it's kind of roughly symmetrical, about 0. So as Kevin mentioned, the median average change is close to 0. It may be a little less than an inch or so. On the horizontal plot, it shows the change in mean annual temperature. That is not centered about 0, because all the models predicted an increase in temperature. As Kevin said, we wanted to pick a scenario where the average precipitation did not change a lot. We're really going to focus on the variability. If we change both the average and the variability, it's kind of hard to tease out what's driving the changes. And then a 75th percentile temperature. So the 75th percentile on this graph is represented by the vertical dashed line. And you can see we've kind of got the models that largely scattered around kind of the crosshairs in the center of this plot. And out to the right, we've zoomed in on the center, and you can see there's a handful of models kind of close to the center. And the one that we selected to move forward with this modeling is the HAD-GEM2 CC model, shown very close to the crosshairs there. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out. That the experts kind of recommend using all 32 models, because that will kind of bracket the range of possible outcomes the best. 32 models, 32 scenarios is a lot of work. If you can't use 32, they recommend using 10. And there's a kind of a list of which 10 models they recommend. And if you can't use 10, they also recommend using 4. And our model, our selected model, the HAD-GEM2, is one of those kind of top 4 models. We don't have scope to do more than one climate change scenario, although it's possible that one of the 4 to be determined ones could be a future climate change scenario that we'll discuss later. But I think it's important when interpreting the results, realize it's just one of many different possible outcomes. I think that's important to keep in mind. So we selected the HAD-GEM2 climate change model. And the next slide, Kevin, if you can just advance the slide, I'll talk about how we modify the hydrology in the baseline model to account for the climate change. I think this will answer some of the questions that have already popped up. So the way we're proposing to do it is we're kind of looking at the effects of the future climate scenario on the hydrology from water years 1994 through 2017. So in the 90s, we know we had some wet years, 95, 98, they were wet. So we're going to rerun the hydrology, but we're going to modify both the precipitation and the temperature input to say what would those wet years look like under a future climate scenario. So we anticipate those wet years will get even wetter. And by contrast, you know, the modeling period also has the drought period, the 2012 through 2016 drought. We anticipate once we adjust our model inputs, it's going to get a little drier, those drought years, as well as being warmer and having higher ET. I mean, we'll come back to these questions a little later. So the way we implement into the model is we modify the daily input to the model, which again is based on the water year 1994 through 2017 meteorology. And we want to do this in a manner that reflects both the spatial and temporal changes indicated by the climate change model. So for the air temperature, it's reasonably straightforward. The input into the geoflow model is daily minimum and maximum temperature at about 13 gauge locations throughout the watershed. And the model then interpolates between those gauge locations, also taking into account elevation. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Ben Hatchett look at those 13 specific locations, look at the results from this particular HAD-GEM2 model, the downscaled results, and then compare the future 2021, 2040 period with the baseline period and calculate some specific increases in temperature that are specific to those 13 locations, and also that vary seasonally, because we also noted that in the summer, the increases in temperature are expected to be greater than they are in the winter. So they'll be applied to the input temperature gauge data, and then the PRIMS routine will interpolate it and apply it to the model. So reasonably straightforward, kind of additive increases to the air temperature will be applied to the model. The precipitation's a little more complex because we're not really changing the average amounts. We're more changing the distribution. We're going to make the wet days wetter and the smaller storms drier. But we're going to use a similar approach. There's about 20 rain gauges in the watershed that we use as model input. And we're going to take those specific locations, give them to Ben Hatchett, and he's going to, again, calculate the change in precipitation frequency distribution from the baseline climate to the future climate. And we're going to use that information to modify our daily time series of daily precipitation amounts. And do that at each of the 20 gauges. Then we have some scripts that use the PRISM data to interpolate that spatially onto the watershed, and we can rerun the model. So we're doing that because we want to get the changes in the variability of the precipitation across the watershed, and there were some small differences spatially across the watershed. So again, we expect once we do that, we'll get the wet days, as using Kevin's example, if we had a 5-inch, it's a day that had maybe 5 inches of rain, maybe in the future that's going to be 5.5 inches. If we had a day that had a 1/10 or a 1/4 of an inch, then maybe that storm in the future climate disappears. So applying these kind of processing to our rainfall inputs, we'll expect to get wetter wets and drier dries. We had a question on the ET. So the PRIMS portion of the geoflow model uses air temperature to calculate as one of the inputs into the evapotranspiration. So we anticipate that by changing the air temperature, the model will automatically increase the ET. The report, the climate change report that Kevin referred to indicates or predicts increased ET of about 5 to 10% in the watershed. So we can kind of check the PRIMS results against that. And we can make additional adjustments if necessary. Related to the increased ET, we may end up changing the demands. I think this is something still in discussion, but if we assume that the agriculture, for instance, is kind of continuing as is currently, then there's going to be a need for additional water to irrigate the crops to overcome the additional ET, to keep the crops in good condition. So we're thinking about, do something, increasing the pumping a little bit or increasing deliveries from Lake Casitas to potentially account for increased demands in the watershed. Should we look at these questions now?
Yes.
There are two other questions.
Yeah.
So can you see the questions? Are you essentially modeling near-term effects of climate change?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're looking through the 2021, 2040 scenario. So kind of, I guess, a nearer term. There's almost an infinite number of climate change scenarios that could be looked at, and I think the goal here is to, it may not be to answer sigma questions so much as just give a flavor for what's possible and for what can be done with the model. I think we wanted to do something a little more near term to kind of make it a little real for people. When you look too far ahead, people tend to, maybe not pay as much attention. But definitely, there's room for people to use this model to evaluate DWR's approach. Loca downscaled.
I can answer that
I'm
one.
not sure what. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
The answer is yes. I went back and checked the 2019 report, and it says in the first paragraph of the executive summary that yes, they used local downscale versions of the global climate models for their analysis. The next question.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Paul. I think the scatter plot that we showed a couple of slides ago really emphasizes there's a lot of variability in the possible outcomes, and that's why I say we're picking one. I think it's important. If your plan is in the watershed, you need to consider more than one. I think California is particularly challenging with precipitation because a lot of it is dominated by these, the atmospheric river that we just had last week in October of all months. And if that moves 100 miles north or 100 miles south, it can vastly change the amount of precip you get. I think that's why California in particular has a lot of variabilities in the precip predictions. Other things though, such as the increased air temperature. I mean, yeah, there's a range, but we kind of know that's going to increase, so the ET is going to go up. So I think there's a lot of things that, a lot of aspects that we do have some confidence in. The ridiculously resilient high pressure. I remember that from was it 2014, where we just barely got any rain. These are good. These are great comments. Things like that drought that happened, the 2012 to 2016, will get summoned worse in the future through this approach. But it's a good comment, and people should read it and take it on board. Two new messages down there. Sorry.
Yes. Newest question is, how will you account for changes in return flows from climate change? Higher temperatures may mean more evaporative losses, but there may be more applied water due to higher demands.
Yeah, it's a good question. The model has all that built in. It's physically modeled, the return flows. So we put some irrigation on the crops through the water transfer function, which is part of PRIMS. We just say, okay, here's our daily irrigation amount, which we change seasonally. So it depends. If we decide to increase the irrigation to account for the increased ET, and to do that, we need to also increase the pumping or diversions from the lake or find some water from somewhere else. Then that will be included in the model. If we don't increase the irrigation, I expect those return flows, as calculated by the model, will go down quite a bit.
I'll take this next question from Bruce Kubler. How's the water board expected to use this scenario to make allocation decisions or to consider sensitivity to water supply changes or question mark. I'm not sure if the question was finished there. That's a really good question. I think that this is definitely a starting point for us to understand, and for everyone to understand, how will water supplies be different in the next 20 years? You know, the practice of superimposing these changes on the past tells us how would the last 25 years have been different with these stressors. And I think that can inform the next, that can inform the water management decisions going forward, that, you know, we can probably expect these changes to occur in the next 20 years, and they should be, you know, taken into any taken into consideration for, you know, any and all water management decisions. More technically, we have been actually thinking about as you know, we have more scenarios that we want to run. We'll get into that when we get to the to be determined section of this presentation. But we are even thinking about, combining a climate change scenario with something else, like a water management scenario, so that we could see how would that water management scenario unfold with the stressors of climate change on it. But we want to run it as an independent scenario first to be able to isolate the changes that the climate change scenario that predicts will occur. And then as a second scenario, or later, we could, like I said, we can mash it up. We could combine it with a second scenario or a second set of changes to, say, water demand, to see how climate change would affect the availability of water for water supplies under a different water management regime. These are really good questions. Does anyone else have any? Did Al or anyone else, is there anything else you wanted to add to how the water boards will use this scenario to make allocation decisions or consider sensitivity?
I think you covered it, Kevin.
Okay. All right, let's keep going, and feel free to chime with more questions, please.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, the third scenario is the Mesa Dam Removal. So the graphic on the right just shows kind of a map around Mesa Reservoir. I think currently there's a little less water in it and more sediment than shown here. But I think most people are aware there's a plan to remove the dam, and the idea of this scenario is to try to understand, any changes to stream flows, but perhaps more importantly, groundwater levels as a result of removing the dam. So it's fairly straightforward to modify the model to remove the dam. So we're going to remove the dam. We'll remove some of the sediment behind the dam. So it's been infilled over the many years that since the dam was built. So we're going to have to decrease the elevation to kind of reflect the more natural stream bed. We're going to turn off any reservoir releases. I think historically, Casitas Municipal Water District would open a valve at the dam to, during the spring to let more water down to the Ventura so they could divert to Lake Casitas. We're going to turn those releases off, and then we have to create a stream network to route flows through the former reservoir. So the two graphics on the lower left indicate how we do that. The one on the left is kind of the current model setup, and the one on the right shows how we just recreated the stream network through Mesa Reservoir. So effectively, the lake and the dam will be removed from the model. And we did a similar approach for the unimpaired flow scenario as well for Mesa. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's move along to the next one, fourth scenario, and this one it's a little more than a scenario. We called it a recalibration because we're actually going to get in there and change some of the model parameters to try to capture the effects of the Thomas fire. So just to refresh your memory, the Thomas fire burned in late 2017 through 2018. It burned, I forget the fraction, maybe 3/4 of the watershed, pretty much all the non-urban or non-ag areas burned during that fire. There was kind of the pocket in the Ojai, in the middle of the watershed where the urban and ag areas, which really didn't burn a lot. So the goal of this is to understand the effects of the fire on the hydrology of the watershed, particularly the effects on surface water flows, which we expect to probably increase and become more flashy, and then probably more importantly the groundwater levels. I think it's generally understood that there'll be less recharge as a result of the fire, at least in the year or few years following the fire. So to do this, first step is extend the modeling period beyond water year 2017 to include water years 2018 through 2020. So to do this, we need to obtain all the precipitation data, the pumping data. We need information on water delivery data and demands to basically redo the supply and demand analysis that we presented at the second webinar back in, I think it was late May of this year. So that's got to be redone for those 3 years. So this bullet point here in red is to kind of give folks who are on the call here a heads up that if we ask for data for you earlier when setting up the model, we're going to be coming back and asking for more data so that we can set up kind of the information in the model about how water was moved around and how much pumping occurred and things like that. So once we've set the model up for those 3 years, the first step we'll do is run the model, and we will compare the outputs of that model to the actual measurements that occurred. And we expect they will not match because of the effects of the fire. So for example, post-fire, we expect the stream flows to be higher during the storm events, due to changes in the infiltration capabilities of the soil. And then the goal would be to then go back and adjust the model parameters, and there's a kind of list of things that will adjust on the lower left of the screen to better match the model prediction with the measured data. So we'll end up getting kind of two scenarios out of this. One would be a scenario to reflect the burn conditions, and another one would be the scenario to reflect what the conditions could have been if Thomas Fire had not occurred. And by comparing those two scenarios, you can really understand the changes, the differences in, for example, groundwater recharge as a result of the fire. So a couple of the parameters, the hydrophobic soils that can form after these fires, we'll change some of the runoff parameters in the PRIMS model. We'll change to reflect the lower ET due to the vegetation being burned. We can change the capillary storage, or we can get in there and change the PET coefficients. There's some literature studies where this has been done in a few watersheds for PRIMS models. I haven't found one where I've done it for a GS flow model. We may need to get in and change some of the riparian ET. Although if you look at the map on the right, which shows burn severity, if you kind of look closely, you'll notice that the severity of the burn is generally lower up into the creeks. I think the riparian vegetation wouldn't be as flammable as the other vegetation, so maybe that is not needed. We may change the canopy interception, although I don't think that's a big player in this watershed. And then the land use, the crops. I think the graphic on the right, it's hard to see, but the crops are shown in black polygons. And most of the severe burning occurred outside the crop region. So there may not be much change in land use there. That's something that we'll consider. From this result, we'll get kind of two sets of model output, one with fire effects and one without fire effects. One final point, I think we're anticipating that we may see the effects of fire in the first winter after the fire, but watersheds can often, from a hydrologic point of view, recover fairly quickly. So it may be that we only see changes in the first year, maybe we'll see changes in the second year as well. That's another thing that we'll kind of learn from this exercise, is how quickly the hydrology of the watershed kind of went back to pre-burn scenarios. I think we have a pause for questions now. So I see some coming through on Matilaha.
There are two questions, Al. Let's start with the question from Mr. Paul
Yeah.
Daly.
Yeah, good question. So I should have gone upon that. So currently the Matilda Reservoir is represented by lake HRUs in the PRIMS model and the lake package in the mod flow portion of GS flow model. So we're going to replace all those with land cells. So the answer is yes, and we'll just use kind of values of the land cells from surrounding from the surrounding cells. And for Matilda, there's not that many. Probably I don't know if you look at the images on the lower left, our 330-foot HRUs are shown here in squares, and that's the size of our grid. So we're going to change, a handful of these HRUs. So,
sorry to jump in. I wanted to read that question out loud, or just in general, read all questions out loud in case people can't see them. So Paul's question was, for Matilda Dam, do you change the vegetation in the reservoir area to reflect future conditions, for example, change in ET?
Yeah, we do. So we change it. I guess there might be two things you can say. We change it from lake HRUs to land HRUs, using the surrounding properties, I guess. Maybe we're not, at this point, we haven't considered changing it for climate change, but that is something that could be done if that's what your question was getting at. If the dam's not removed for another 10 years, we're kind of in the middle of that climate change period, and maybe it makes sense to run a climate change scenario with Matilda Dam removed. There's a lot of things that can be done with this model. So I think we might have a bullet on that in the second half of the talk today.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Paul had a follow-up comment that some of that area will become upland chaparral versus riparian vegetation. We do have some maps you can use. Yes, please send those in to us. That's the kind of data that we are soliciting, the kinds of comments we're soliciting. That's extremely helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then there's a second question here from Randall Hansen. For the Matilda Dam, the foundation of the dam was also a groundwater flow barrier. Was this included originally, and will this be addressed in this scenario?
I'd have to check. DB Stevens isn't on the call. They couldn't make it today. I think we did have some representation of low permeability below the dam. I guess I have another question, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer. Is that going to be removed as part of the dam removal? The barrier beneath the dam? Does anyone know the answer to that?
If you want to unmute, we're happy to unmute you.
Bedrock sill. Okay, so if it's a bedrock sill, that would be part of the geologic model that DB Stevens would have conducted. There's increased sedimentation. Yes. The storage in Matilda Dam, when it was first built in, was it the 40s? About 7,000 acre feet. So substantial storage. Over time, it's been sedimented in as well as notched down, which decreases the storage. My understanding is now, and specifically after the fire where there was a lot of sediment production upstream, the storage is pretty close to zero right now. I'd have to check, but I think at the beginning of the modeling period, like in the 90s, there might have still been 1,000 or so acre feet of storage. We do have a table. I think the Watershed Protection District had some measurements, and we will have a table in our report that's coming out in December of kind of showing how it decreased. I think the table includes information from the 70s through to pretty recently. So the answer is, over the modeling period, I think it decreased from maybe about 1,000 acre feet to close to zero by the end of it. But I'd have to check those numbers.
Just for
and that is a limitation of the model. The model is not able to represent that change in storage. I think we picked kind of a mid-value number.
And just for everyone, I was just reading that question out. Tom Hicks wrote, my understanding with increased sedimentation is that there has been less water supply storage over time. Can you please remind us how many acre feet are stored at Matilla Dam each year?
Sorry, I'll try to remember to read the question. Sorry.
Okay, I can read, Shahab and I can read them for you. There's a question about Thomas Fire and LiDAR. We'll come back to Thomas Fire. Let's do Matilla Dam all at once. Will sediment transport modeling be incorporated to see if changes in stream geometry have any effect on modeling of low flows?
Yeah, no, we're not doing sediment transport modeling. I think my understanding is there will be some changes in the channel downstream as part of the dam removal process. I think they're widening some bridges so they can get the sediment out of there from, when they first take down the dam. These are kind of fairly, well, they're important from a hydraulic perspective and a flood risk perspective. I think they're a lot less important from a kind of general hydrology perspective. So, they might be important for the very high flows and flood risk, but that's not really the focus of the model. And I also think there will be changes, anytime there's a big water year that the stream geometry changes, and that is another, limitation of the model. We're assuming a fixed geometry, if you will, of the stream. But again, I don't think that's a major limitation. It's for the purpose of the model, I don't think it has a huge effect. I guess in the future, there'll be more sediment coming into the system once the dam is gone, and maybe there'll be some a new kind of geomorphologic stable condition that it finds that we're not really considering that in the model.
Yeah, so just to summarize what Al just said, so the downstream mitigation projects that are being done in preparation for removing Matilla Dam will not be represented because they're hydraulic. They change water hydraulics, but they have, like Al said, less of an impact on the hydrology that our model represents. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple comments. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Shahab.
Yeah, I have unmuted Mr. Paul Jenkins. I believe he would like to add something to his comments verbally.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. Al, your descriptions of Matilla Dam are very good. You've obviously read most of the studies, but I just wanted to point out that, with the current condition, not only lake, but there's also that vast riparian forest upstream. And so when that gets incised down into the future stream bed, you'll have a more narrow riparian strip of vegetation surrounded by more upland around it. And that's the point I was trying to make. And yeah, there would be a bedrock sill at the site of the dam. So that would be a limiting groundwater, as was suggested. But then the most
so you're saying,
go ahead.
So the kind of fan upstream of the lake in the map here, is there information on how they expect that to incise down? Yeah,
there is sort of a preliminary vegetation map of that. It's all kind of guesswork, of course, because we don't know. But a lot of that will remain on high terraces. Not all the sediment will flush out with dam removal. And then my other comment that I tried to type in there was just that, after the Thomas fire, we saw, well, initially very fine sediment and ash that created that sort of hydrophilic layer through the upper Ventura River aquifer. But then after the sand and gravel came down the following year, and it really appeared to enhance the capillary storage in that zone. So that's actually would be one of the goals of Matilla Dam, would be to restore that sediment transport. And I think we would see some water storage changes relating to that. I don't know how you can really model and account for that, but it's something to consider.
In that reach of the Ventura River itself, additional storage?
Yeah, downstream.
Like additional infiltration, because you have smaller or different grain sizes of sediment coming down?
Yeah, so right now, or before the Thomas fire, the riverbed was primarily, large cobble, really embedded. And I think that you have a different storage capacity when you have more of the sand and gravel and finer material mixed in.
Yeah, I think the cobbles wouldn't really hold the water for any plant growth. It's going to just go down. So is that kind of the point? Whereas the silts and sands, you might get more growth, or there's more water available for growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
I think that's what we saw after the Thomas fire. And then the other thing, you guys don't really need to get into the weeds on this too much, but we will be seeing in the next couple of storms more sand and potentially gravel coming over the top of Matilaha Dam, because it's rapidly reaching its capacity right now. So it's almost completely filled. So that's sort of, a 10-year scenario if the dam is not removed.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Interesting. I want to thank you, Paul, for all those details. I want to go back up there's a couple comments here on Thomas fire. So we'll do these couple post Thomas fire questions and we'll take a break. So the first, Randall Hansen, a new post-fire LiDAR was completed. Will this be used to estimate stream network elevations and slopes?
Yeah, we're not going to use that new LiDAR. It's just a lot of work, I think, for minimal impact on the model. In terms of stream changes in the braided or the lower portions of the river, that can change with any big storm. So changing the model from storm to storm is not really feasible. I don't know I think we may have looked at if there'd been any appreciable change, kind of in the other parts of the watershed that would substantially influence the model results. And I don't think that's really going to have a large impact for our hydrology model. Again, if you're doing flood analysis, definitely you'd want to look at that LiDAR and get a better understanding of how things may have changed. But for our hydrology model, especially the surface water groundwater interaction, I don't think it's going to be that important.
Okay, and then we just discussed Paul's comment about effects of the Thomas fire on the transport of fine sand gravel with enhanced capillary storage in the Rivel's reach, which would be similar to the expected effects of Mesa Dam Removal. Are any of all the scenarios, excuse me, here's a new question from Ashley Kennedy. Are any or all of these scenarios going to be used to modify the TMDL? And if so, when? That is a great question for June Zhu. Is that something that you could respond to, June? June might, oh, hello.
Yeah, I'm still here. Certainly we will take into consideration when we come, to that point. But I think this is just, if you will, first step of a long process. So first we get to this, hydrologic part of the model, and then next phase will be the nitrogen transport portion of the model, and then we'll take into consideration, this additional source assessment due to the groundwater, right, to the surface water. So, and then we'll see how we can use information, to inform whether it's implementation or whether it's TMDL reconsideration. So everything's on the table.
I also want to add that there will be a suite of scenarios or set of scenarios that, oh, sorry, I'll repeat this last question. This is from Ashley Kennedy. Are any or all of these scenarios going to be used to modify the TMDL? And if so, when? So I just want to add that the nitrogen transport model is the second part of this project. So these are the scenarios that we're proposing to evaluate or are going to evaluate with the groundwater surface water model. That groundwater surface water model will be releasing the draft version of it in December this year. For this project, the next thing that we'll be releasing after that is the draft nitrogen transport model. And that comes out spring of next year. And that model report will include scenarios that will have been evaluated with that model. So there will be scenarios that are evaluated with the nitrogen transport model, and those scenario results will be shared next year. Any new questions? Thomas Fire. Okay. Well, it's about 10:15. This was our break point. So we'll take a break here. We'll be back at 10:30. Okay, we're back at 10:30, and Regina Hirsch, I see your comment. Yes, we actually have a slide on a local cooperative agreement scenario, local water management actions. So if any chance you're able to rejoin later in this scenario, please let me know. Otherwise, we should talk, because that's a scenario that we want to evaluate, but we are soliciting data on. So we should talk. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We'll be back at 10:30. I'll leave a local cooperative agreement. Oh, okay, we'll stop here. Okay. So the second part of this webinar is a little different. As we've mentioned before, we have some ideas on what the 4 remaining to be determined scenarios are that we would like to, or that we could evaluate with under our current scope and budget for this project. And just as a reminder, the 8 scenarios that we select are just a starting point of what can be evaluated with this model. It's just what we're going to have our consultants build and evaluate under this project and under our current scope and budget. And so many of these scenario ideas could be just the starting point of future conversations where these scenarios are tweaked or they're edited and iterated on, and they also can we hope that they continue to be seeds for discussion on their topics. So we've kind of picked up several different ideas for scenarios over the years that we've heard. We wanted to share with you what we've kind of heard so far, and maybe what those ideas are and what would change in the scenarios. So these ideas are not as well built out as the methodology that we've been presenting so far. And that's because we're still selecting what these scenarios would be. So this second half of the presentation is definitely more of a back and forth. We hope to be hearing a lot from you and letting lots of people unmute and talk to us. Yeah, this will all inform what we pick for the remaining 4 scenarios, but it'll also inform what people look at in the future with this model. So this list of ideas that we have is unexhaustive. It's just a starting point. Okay, so the first scenario idea that we've heard, and these are alphabetical, by the way. The first idea that we've heard is to do another bookend scenario, similar to unimpaired flow. And the question here, so I try to frame all these scenarios with a question. And the question here is, what water demand reductions are needed to meet the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's flow recommendations exactly as they are for water years 1994 to 2017. So as a reminder for everybody, in this Water Action Plan, Water Resiliency Portfolio Initiative that the state is working on, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife recommends flows to the State Water Board, and then we take that into consideration and consider developing balanced flow objectives that balance the human and ecosystem uses of water. But for this scenario, we thought about, what if we did a bookend? What if we did what if we took the California Department of Fish and Wildlife scenario and reduce water demand to meet those flow recommendations exactly as they are for water years 1994 to 2017. So what would change in this scenario? It's water demand. And the fundamental question is, how is water demand reduced to meet the flow recommendations? So for example, State Water Board, we could set up this scenario so that water rights are curtailed through the water rights priority system. Or we could reduce water demand through some kind of local cooperative agreement where maybe there's a blanket water use reduction across the watershed, or there's a package of water user specific reductions that try and meet this this flow recommendation exactly as is for water years 1994 to 2017. So any questions, any thoughts on this idea for a scenario? Okay, let's let that one germinate. I will continue. So our next scenario idea is how would the eradication of Arundo downax have changed surface flows and groundwater levels during water years 1994 to 2017? A California Invasive Plant Council report from 2011 estimates that in the Ventura River watershed, Arundo uses 5,000 acre-feet more water per year than native riparian species. So for this scenario, so on the map here on the right, this is a map of where Arundo is represented in the model. So Arundo is represented in the current model as a vegetation type, with ET and a rooting depth. And so what if we removed all of this Arundo and replaced it with native vegetation? So that would change the land use or change the vegetation type, and we would be reducing the evapotranspiration rates for Arundo and altering the rooting depth for the native, altering the rooting depth to reflect native vegetation instead of Arundo. And just kind of as a ballpark, Arundo uses 24 acre-feet of water per acre per year versus native vegetation uses about 4 acre-feet per acre-feet of water per year per acre. So this is another scenario idea. So, how much water savings would occur without Arundo in both dry and wet years? I'm just going to kind of pause again for questions or thoughts or comments, or I also can just keep going and we can kind of come back to any of these. The Arundo has already been removed. You can look at hindsight. I was under the impression that Arundo had not been eradicated from the watershed, but is in the process of being removed from top to bottom. I don't know, Paul, if you want to unmute and elaborate.
Yeah, so Arundo eradication began in Matilaha Creek in 2007, and the county has done multiple passes. So for all practical purposes, especially if you're looking at water supply, you could look at the Matilaha gauge, and you could look at pre-2007 versus post and see if you actually notice anything. And I've done this, and on the back of the envelope calculation, I figured there should be about 3 or 4 CFS at least that we're not seeing. So my opinion, and hasn't been validated, but you guys could do that, is go back and see if Arundo actually uses the volume of water that is suggested here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, this is Al. So you're saying you've looked at the data, you don't think you see a 3 or 4 CFS increase since post 2007?
No.
Okay.
And there's been, I forgot the numbers, but there's acres and acres of Arundo that has, for all practical purposes, been eliminated. They're still chasing resprouts, but they've gone all the way from the headwaters down to Highway 150. And obviously it's been pursued elsewhere in the watershed, and there's a comprehensive program underway. But the fact that, you know, a lot of this has already been removed, you could actually go back and see if there's any real value to water supply.
Thank you for that insight. We have a comment that will the 20 acre feet of stream flow, or will that 20 acre feet all be stream flow, or will that be more impactful to the groundwater? And that's referencing the change in ET rate, I think. That's a comment from Tony Madrone. That's a good question. We don't know. That's kind of why we'd want to run the scenario, is to see how groundwater levels and surface water flows would change if all Arunda was replaced with native vegetation. It does sound like something, you know, there has been successful eradication efforts, at least partway through the watershed, and so, but we'd be looking at fully removing it in this scenario and just replacing it entirely with native vegetation. Just a comment from Bert Rapp. I second Paul Jenkins' comments. This is a very important analysis to do. Okay, cool. I'll give people another minute to write in on either Arunda or the CDFW scenario that we proposed. And if anyone wants to unmute and talk to us, just let us know. We'll give you permission to unmute. I think we'll keep going. And this is a very free form rest of the meeting here, so we can bump around to any of these scenarios as we're continuing. So the next scenario idea is one I'm really excited about the option of doing. So this idea is, how would groundwater levels and surface water flows have been different for water years 1994 to 2017 if the Ojai Basin and Upper Ventura River Basin groundwater sustainability plans were in place and were implemented? So as most folks probably here know, the groundwater basins, the GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, are working on their plans and are working hard to submit those ahead of the January, or in time for the January 2022 deadline with the Department of Water Resources. And so this scenario, I thought it would be pretty interesting to put both plans in one scenario and see how water supplies would be different if those plans were in place as a water management regime. So what would change technically in this scenario? We would change groundwater pumping to be consistent with what is proposed in the two groundwater sustainability plans. And so we have a request here in red, as we need, we're asking the GSAs for plan summaries and specifically data on where pumping may change, by how much will pumping change, under what conditions or times of the year, or water year types, dry versus wet years, or right, or any of the thresholds that might influence when groundwater pumping is changed under these plans. So we understand, or we acknowledge that the GSAs are very, very busy right now doing their comment solicitation on their plans, and but if there is opportunity to work together to develop this scenario in the next 2 to 3 months, that would be really cool, really great. Any thoughts on this idea? Upper Ventura, thank you, Brian. And Upper Ventura River GA can help in January or February. Okay, that's promising. Yeah, I think we'd be looking for some guidelines on how to change pumping to be consistent. And we can also dig into your plans as well, but being able to meet and talk and get data that we can use would help expedite the process considerably. So any other thoughts on this idea? Okay. GSPs do not propose changes in pumping. Okay. yeah, if they're, that's important. If they're, yeah, we'd have to see what, if any, water management, groundwater pumping rules or changes would be in place to see if there's anything to simulate. Okay, I'll just continue then. So the next draft scenario idea is to simulate a local cooperative agreement, also known as, say, a voluntary agreement. So the idea is here is, how would a local water management agreement have changed surface water flows and groundwater levels during water years 1994 to 2017? So the idea here is, if there was a local effort to change water demand or take other actions that would impact surface water flows and groundwater levels, how would that have played out during the last 23 years of the modeling period? So what would we change in this scenario? And this is, I was mentioning this to Regina Hirsch, who I think is off. There's a hand up. Tom. Oh yeah. Okay. So Tom, I'm gonna go ahead.
Just quickly, the Ventura County Resource Conservation District, as many people may already know, has a Wildlife Conservation Board Prop 1 grant for to help enact projects that enhance stream flow. These are completely voluntary solutions and do not engage in regulatory type curtailment scenarios, which are more the regulatory purview of the State Water Board. But through you, Kevin, and others at the State Water Board, we've been exploring a scenario that, regardless of what number the Department of Fish and Wildlife might come up with, or other sort of potential environmental demands there may be, is there a scenario that would be put in your model that would at least find a way to speak to landowners in voluntary terms? And I think, again, I don't want to get too lost in the related comprehensive adjudication, but within that most recent draft, I think it was May 17th, there was a section within it, section 7.3.5.1, seems somewhat small in a rather large document, but it specifically focuses on a production forbearance program. And without getting too lost in the details of that, I know that my colleague Regina in particular has been talking with many about different, I call it a toolkit of different project types. Recently, she's unveiled a toolkit catalog. The idea would be that if the voluntary incentives were lined up to work with landowners, there may be a framework or an accounting of conservation actions, like the ones you have here on your list, Kevin. But anyway, I only bring it up at this time because I know that there still remains strong interest to work with the State Water Board on how these type of voluntary programs, I don't want to get lost in how they would be funded, but just simply how they could be designed in a way that connects different aspects of the annual water budget in the watershed. I think the times, as we've heard with climate, there may be longer periods of dry, punctuated by intense periods of rain. And if any number of landowner actions could help create new supply that has common community benefits, legally speaking, we would call them multi-beneficial use projects, municipal water supply benefits, environmental flow benefits, agricultural water needs, creating resiliency. I think these are all things that many people could nod their head and say, that sounds great, let's see the details. And I think that's really where I'd like to sign off here, is just, Kevin, there's strong interest to work with the State Water Board to refine that part of the model, that scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so I think with this scenario, it could, this scenario is fairly, there's a few routes this scenario could take. So what would change in a local cooperative agreement scenario? It's kind of depends on what is proposed to us. So we are soliciting comments and data on a local cooperative agreement scenario to represent in the model. And so some ideas of what could change. We could see, as Tom mentioned, a package of water user specific reductions, water conservation at specific, by specific water right owners, water users in the watershed. But we want the whole package in one scenario. We don't want to try and build a scenario where we just simulate one water user changing their water use. So the getting a full package of all water user specific reductions could be represented, and that would be of a scale that would show up. Other ways to change water demand is kind of a blanket water use reduction across the watershed. Say there's a 5, 10, 15% reduction in water use. How would that change surface water flows and groundwater levels? A component of this could be in-stream flow dedications. If water right owners are conserving water, but they decide that they want to dedicate a portion of their water right that they're not using to the stream, like could we represent that in the model? Along the same lines, other changes that could be part of a local cooperative agreement are land use changes. So large scale ornamental turf replacement or a change in an existing land use type to a new type. So the golf courses changing, or large scale golf courses reducing the amount of grass that they have, or large scale ornamental turf replacement in cities. That's the kind of a land use type that we could change. And potentially we could also look into increasing the amount of groundwater that infiltrates in urban areas. This is something I've heard Regina talk of for, say, the city of Ojai, is say cutting sidewalks to increase the amount of water that runs, that infiltrates into the groundwater instead of going into the sewer and bypassing the watershed and just kind of getting funneled quickly out into the stream. So could we decrease the effective imperviousness of urban areas such as like the city of Ojai or others? So these are all components or options for a local cooperative agreement scenario. And at this point, we need proposals and data on what this scenario would look like. So what is the package of water use reductions, for example, and where are they? Or if this is a turf replacement, or if some kind of land use change, turf replacement, urban infiltration, can we get spatial data, like something we could use in ArcGIS to swap out land use and imperviousness and replace it with something new for this scenario? So with that, that's kind of the big ask here is, could you help us build this scenario in the next 2 to 3 months? And there's a hand raise from Tony Madrone, so I'm going to give you permission to mute.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I just wanted to make comment that we are in process of developing the toolkit quantification, and Tom was speaking about the toolkit and the framework and the tools. And so with Creeklands, we're developing a model that will be able to assess on a per parcel basis what the impact of the application of those tools would be. For example, rainwater use, gray water reuse, rain gardens for infiltration. So the idea would be that each parcel in and of itself, we would be able to identify as what that potential impact would be of applying a variation of tools. Also, the model will be able to zoom out, look at neighborhoods, look at the entire watershed to be able to make a similar assessment as to what would be the impact of applying gray water or rainwater to this entire watershed or entire community. So that is in development, and will be something that we will be excited to figure out how to incorporate and share with you all to to help move this all forward.
Do you have a timeline of, like, would you be able to put some like a description of a scenario with some data or files that we could use in the next couple months together?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll synchronize with Regina and discuss what kind of timeline we could to help put together some some scenarios that might be able to support this scenario for you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, well, I'll follow up with you and Tom and Regina about talking offline. Similar.
Yeah, this is Al.
Go ahead.
I think that'll sound great. I guess, you know, if there's water conservation measures or just savings in general that take place, I think some indication of where it's anticipated those savings would be reflected. Like, is it going to be a little less pumping? Is it going to be a little less deliveries from Casitas? I'm just thinking in terms of some of the model inputs. You know, we'll need to change the land use, and that's kind of GIS as well, but also need to change if it's reduced demand, some indication of how much, you know, for example, the pumping would decrease and which pumping, or how much, you know, the Casitas surface water deliveries would decrease, or local surface water diversions as well, if it's one of those. So they're kind of the, not to be overlooked kind of in terms of changing the inputs into the model. That'd be helpful.
Definitely, yeah. There is the layer that of water sourcing to be applied to this as well, so that like you're speaking of, we can identify what the impact of that reduced consumption would be. So that is also going to be one of the layers that will be built in as well.
Great.
There's a couple of questions here that I've kind of skipped past related to drought and the UCSB wheat model. We will come back to those. There's a question here from Christopher Danch. What is and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. What is a deadline for submission of proposals under the local cooperative agreement scenario? That's a good question. We understand that it takes a little bit of time to pull this kind of information together. I would say, you know, we're soliciting comments and data through December 3rd. So if you can, by December 3rd, if you can give us a framework or you know, a proposal of like, this is what we propose for this scenario, that would be really helpful, just to know that there's something, you know, concrete in the works that we can use to build this scenario. And then we're happy to spend another month or two, so into January, you know, working on getting data from you and more defining that proposal and getting more specific with it. So I would say, yeah, to anyone that's that wants to help shape this scenario or other scenarios, definitely give us something in writing, please, by December 3rd, and as much detail as you can. And if by then it's kind of clear from there that we can kind of run it down and get the data that we would need to actually build out the scenario, then we'll continue to work on it in the I would say the 2 months that follow. But we should also be talking as early as next week about what we need from you to help shape this scenario. So yeah, details are good. Data of where changes are going to be is good. Well, big question. Okay.
Excuse me, Kevin, did you answer the question from Randall Hansen?
No, and I thank you for reminding me. So a couple questions here. So let's jump forward. Okay, so sorry, one really quick, Christopher, send proposals where, so we're accepting comments at our email address for the in-stream flow unit, which is, I'm just going to skip to it. So it's instreamflows@waterboards.ca.gov. So this is for everyone. Please submit your comments and data to this email address by Friday, December 3rd. And if it's going to take more time to pull together data, or you're, say, busy working on finalizing a groundwater sustainability plan, then we'll work with you to kind of figure out the details of the scenario in the couple months that follow. But we do want to get something. We do want to get some proposals by the end of November to know if we can pursue this scenario more. Well, I'll come back to this slide. It's also on the notice that was used to announce this webinar. It's on our website, this email address. So I'm going to skip back in the slides to this one. So there's a question from Randall Hansen. GSPs, ground sustainability plans, are somewhat exempt from drought years. So how about a mega drought scenario? So that's 2 decades or more of drought. It's a good idea. So some of our other scenario ideas that we don't have full slides for, one of them is drought planning. So, and that could potentially be, 21 dry years. How would 1994 to 2017 have been different if every year was a drought year? That's an interesting scenario. Part of a drought planning scenario can be just applying water use reduction during all drought years. So some reductions in groundwater pumping and surface water diversions, maybe something that's consistent with a state mandate on drought conservation, such as we saw during the last, the mandatory cuts we saw during the last drought, and voluntary cuts that Governor Newsom has been pushing for this year. Other TBD scenario ideas that we've had, one could be new water supplies in the watershed. And the Ventura River watershed is, I think, unique and pretty cool in that it mostly is independent. Its water comes from within. It is not connected to external water sources, but there are a couple of proposals that are either under construction, to my knowledge, or just been proposed for new water supplies. So my knowledge is that the city of Ventura is building a pipeline to connect to state water project water that comes down from Northern California that they pay for. So this is new water supplies that would maybe reduce their demand on the Ventura River watershed. Similarly, I've heard talk of drilling horizontal tunnels above Lake Casitas to tap bedrock, groundwater and bedrock, and use that to help recharge the lake. And I apologize if I butchered that description. This is my coarse understanding of the idea. So those are other scenario ideas. We just talked about drought planning. Additional climate change scenarios could be really, really interesting to run and probably pretty informative. As we mentioned, the 2019 Ventura Climate Report, Ventura County Climate Report, had 32 global climate models, and we picked one of the top 4. But there are many other climate projections in there, and so could we look at some of those other climate change scenarios, or could we combine scenarios? So could we, especially if we're looking to the next 20 years, and we're expecting these impacts of climate change to occur in the next 20 years, could we stack, maybe we could stack unimpaired flow with climate change. So how would water years 1994 to 2017 be different if, how would the unimpaired flow scenario be different if we also had the stressors of climate change? And the same with, how would the Mesa Dam Removal scenario be different with the stressors of climate change superimposed on top of it? This is also, Mesa Dam Removal and climate change in particular might be an interesting scenario to do together, because they are perhaps both represent future conditions that are likely to occur in the watershed. It's kind of the new normal, so to speak. Another pair of existing scenarios that we could combine are a local cooperative agreement with the stressors of climate change stacked on top. So these are just other ideas to kind of help seed the discussion. And with that, I want to take a look back at questions that we've had. Okay, so let's see. Tom Hicks dropped an FYI about the Ventura River Education Physical Solution. So Paul said the UC Santa Barbara WEAP model looked at, I think this referring to local cooperative agreements for water conservation a few years ago. So validation of that analysis would be along the lines of what is being proposed here: landscape changes, gray water reuse, infiltration basins, etc. Yeah, so our local cooperative agreement scenario didn't include any new infiltration basins. It does represent landscape changes and gray water reuse. But if infiltration basins were part of a local cooperative agreement, put that in the proposal, please. Okay, scrolling down. Paul Jenkins wrote that the LCA scenario could be helpful for most helpful for quantifying and prioritizing water efficiency strategies. Tom Hicks writes, is groundwater from deep wells or fractured bedrock within the State Water Resources Control Board groundwater surface water model? Yes, groundwater pumping from bedrock is represented in the model. The leakage of alluvial groundwater to deeper bedrock groundwater is represented, as well as the opposite, bedrock groundwater entering the shallower alluvial aquifers is also represented in the model. Bruce Kubler, if anyone wants to unmute, please just tell me. Bruce Kubler writes, okay, yeah, Brian, I'll let you go in a second. The CDFW scenario is essential for water boards to evaluate flow recommendations. I suggest combining it with climate change. Okay, thank you. Bram Surku writes, would an in-stream flow scenario also include the evaluation by the State Water Board on how to balance human and other environmental needs? It would be great to get some insights on how that process might work. That could be a scenario, is an in-stream flow requirement. That could be a scenario that has a balanced flow objective. So not the full CDFW flow recommendation exactly as is, but something that is balanced. And again, with something like that, we have to kind of recognize that the water boards has, if we're going to regulate water use, there are some restrictions. The most classic way that the State Water Board regulates water use is by the water rights curtailment system, which is by water right priority. But that's why I wrote in this slide that, for this CDFW in-stream flow recommendation, how would water demand be reduced to meet a flow recommendation or a flow requirement? Do we have to, do folks want to see us do it through, do folks want to see what the curtailment process looks like, or should we look at a more voluntary reduction in water use? And would that meet either the flow recommendations or the flow requirements? Okay, so I've just talked a lot. I'm gonna let Brian, I wanna hear what Brian has to say.
Good morning, Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I thought it just might be easier to talk than to try and type. I've got a number of thoughts, and I'm just gonna throw them out in no particular order. The first one is, it's more of a question, and I don't know if today is the right day, but, and I apologize if you've covered it, but I'm curious at some point about understanding what quantitative metrics you're going to use to compare these different scenarios, to put all this massive amount of information that'll come out of the model into some sort of comparative matrix of some kind quantitatively. The one thing that jumps out to me, and maybe one of the elephants in the room is, 8 scenarios isn't a lot. There's a lot of different questions that are going to come up through this process, and so I encourage the state board to start thinking about how they might expand the ability to do more analysis. For the GSP, we ran dozens of model runs to just look at depletion of interconnected surface water, just to give you some perspective. So I guess I'm a little concerned that we're going to get through this process and realize that there's more modeling that needs to be done in order to answer the basic questions that you're working on. Third point, that we learned from our modeling for Upper Ventura River is that the timing and location of pumping matters. So sort of these concepts of blanket water use reductions, probably aren't the most efficient way to meet various objectives. And so I think we need to be thinking about, again, more modeling in order to be able to ask questions about, does changing conditions here at this time affect the objective we're trying to achieve, as opposed to just a blanket. We know from experience in other basins that blanket reductions aren't typically the most efficient way to solve the problems. And so there's probably ways to design solutions that could be more efficient, and we'd want to model those. Fourth point or question is, how do we, or in terms of other possible scenarios, I think that looking at some of the sensitive parameters in the model and how they affect these results within the scenario. So running these scenarios multiple times and perturbing the most sensitive parameters might be informative to look at the range of uncertainty in these outcomes. Fifth point is more of a question about how is this process going to continue on in the future in terms of refining the analysis, updating the flow objectives in concert with collecting more data and improving our understanding and our tool to make these analyses. I know that was a lot of information, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for all those points. Would anyone from the water boards, the project team, like to?
Kevin, yeah, this is Dan Worth from State Water Board. I just wanted to touch on the additional scenario comment from Brian. You kind of touched on it at the very beginning of the presentation, but I just wanted to add a little bit to that. As Kevin mentioned, these are 8 scenarios that we've scoped through this contract that we have with our consultants. And if we undertake a flow objective setting process or some kind of rule-making process, we would likely run additional scenarios beyond these 8. And so I think that kind of gets to Brian's comment that there's likely a need for many more scenarios to be run. And I think that's something that we would do beyond these 8 scenarios if we were to start a flow objective setting process or some kind of rule-making process. So I think that that was a great question or point to make, Brian. Thanks for bringing that up.
I agree. Does anyone else from water boards, project team want to add anything? I see a raised hand from Bruce Kubler. I'm going to give you permission to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. In light of Brian's comment, you've got 2 different levels of detail for the models that are being run. You've got your model, which has 100 meters on the side for your analysis, and you've got the groundwater agency model that uses a much smaller size pixel, basically. And it seemed like the water board ought to have a process to be able to utilize the more accurate site-specific models of the groundwater agencies in combination with the broader overview model that you have. I think using yours only for the evaluation would be missing some of the fine points that Brian just raised.
It's a good comment. Yeah, is there going to be an opportunity to learn, like for knowledge transfer for the GSA's model that folks can learn how to use it and start using it to run scenarios?
I would think so. I mean, it seemed like something that that ought to be something that the water board, you and might work with Brian on for details. I'm just thinking that from an overall perspective, it would be good to model the 2, work the 2 together to come up with a better analysis somehow, instead of just using your course model where it's not going to recognize the significance of the location and timing of pumping that Brian just mentioned.
And I think that some of that also has to do with the types of questions that are asked and the type of information that we're trying to obtain from the model. So, but I think that is valid, but it does kind of go back to like, what is the question or what is the data we're trying to pull out of the model? And I think maybe kind of depends on scenarios. Like if it's one of these scenarios, maybe a finer scale model does not help. Maybe another scenario, maybe a finer scale model could help. But I think that that is a great point, that there's other information out there and it's all important. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that. And well, sounds like we got a few different things to talk about with Brian regarding building a scenario that potentially building a scenario that represents the GSPs, but also that about knowledge transfer. So anyone else? We've got we're kind of at the end of the slides in terms of the scenario ideas. So we're here until noon. I have some maps if they're needed. I do have a review of the timeline for this project for the next 6 months that I can go into, but I really want to make this time available if people want to talk about any of these ideas, the four determined scenarios, options for the to be determined scenarios, questions about what kinds of data we're looking for, at what scale we're looking for data. I really want to hammer home that as much as we want to build, say, a local cooperative agreement scenario, we need your help to do it. We need some concrete information that we can use to build that out. For example, and there was some other topics. There's some other questions in here about, like, say, drought planning. So, if one scenario could be, this was mentioned in chat, but what about a mega drought where you've got 23 dry years, and how would water use be reduced to meet during that situation? That's just something that was mentioned.
And Kevin, could you maybe just go back to the slide where you had an outline of the 4 scenarios that have been decided that we're going to run through this project, and then the 4 to be determined scenarios, and those, I think we're interested in input on any of these 8, but I think these 4 to be determined scenarios are ones that we really want to get feedback on, what would be good scenarios to run. And so if you could just kind of run through the 4 that we are planning on running, and then just these ideas.
Sure.
For other ones.
Yeah, I can do that. So as a review or a summary, our first scenario is going to evaluate unimpaired flow, where there's no human use of water in the watershed. And so the idea here is to determine and understand how much water is available to be put to human and ecosystem beneficial uses. This scenario removes reservoirs as places that store water, because those are appropriative water rights, and all surface water rights are set to 0. There's no irrigation under the scenario, but all land use is otherwise kept. And so native vegetation, agriculture, ornamental vegetation, all uses water that comes from rain and is tapped from the groundwater. We remove water contributions from the wastewater treatment plant, from septic tanks, and all other, and otherwise the physical character of the watershed remains the same. So anything that, like levees, channelization, imperviousness, paved city streets and things like that, that all is kept to represent how water runs off into sewers versus infiltrates into the groundwater aquifer system. That's all kept. Land use kept with existing conditions. And
you could just list them off.
Okay,
I just wanted to remind
Okay.
people like what the 4 were that we're planning on running, and then.
Yep. So climate change is the next one that we know we're going to run, and we've selected a climate change model that predicts about 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit increase in annual average temperature in Ventura, in the Ventura River watershed, with increased variability in precipitation, but not really any increase in the total amount of precipitation that comes each year. So we're trying to represent those wetter wets and drier dries and overall hotter conditions. We're going to do a scenario where we remove Mesa Dam, and we got some hopeful comments about changing nearby vegetation to represent post-dam kind of condition of the Mesa Canyon, riparian versus chaparral. We're going to do a post-Thomas fire recalibration of the model. This is a pretty big scenario. Actually, it's more than just a scenario. It's actually extending the modeling period for another 3 years. And so we'll be coming back to to many of you with new requests for data to build out this scenario for to build out the model to run for another 3 years. So we'll be needing things like groundwater pumping data sets, like CDIS operations, Matilda reservoir levels. We'll be pulling the streamflow gauge, groundwater level monitoring data, the precipitation data. So this is going to be a lot of work. And then some of our TBD ideas to review. We want to potentially look at CDFW's in-stream flow recommendation exactly as is, as a bookend scenario, to understand like how much water reduction would be needed to meet this this flow recommendation before it's been balanced. Eradication of invasive arundo is another one. Removing all arundo from the model. So it's currently in the model. So we remove all arundo, replace it with native vegetation, see how water uses differ, groundwater levels and surface water levels are different. And another idea is to represent both groundwater sustainability plans in one model and see how the watershed would have been different if both plans were in place during the modeling period. Similarly, that's one where we're definitely going to need to work with the two GSAs on getting some data and some summaries of whatever water management changes are in their plans. The local cooperative agreement scenario is one we're particularly excited about running. And this is one where we want to simulate a local cooperative solution that and how that would change surface water flows and groundwater levels. And this one we need proposals on what changes in the scenario. So how is water demand changed? Are there in-stream flow dedications? If it's specific water users or property owners reducing their water use, conserving water through gray water, recycling, we need all of that whole package of water user specific reductions kind of compiled into one scenario that's kind of all summarized. And does this scenario include any other changes, such as to land use or imperviousness? Land use, particularly, I'm talking about vegetation. Is vegetation changed from something that consumes more water to less? If you want to work with us on developing a local cooperative agreement scenario, please email us as soon as possible and submit your proposals by December 3rd. And please include as much description of the data that you'll be able to pull together. Also have some TBD ideas, such as new water supplies in the watershed, drought planning. This could even include a mega drought, looking at climate change more, or combining climate change with some of these other existing scenarios. So we can add the stressors of climate change on top of, other water management scenarios or other conditions that we are evaluating. I think that one is in particularly a very good idea, because climate change will be unfortunately, is probably going to be the new norm in all of California. Okay, so I just want to kind of look back at a couple of questions here. How does the calibrated model skill of flow and stage align itself with the CDFW proposed flow target requirements of flow and stage? Randall, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Would you like to unmute and clarify maybe? Okay.
I just tried to provide access to Randall to unmute. So
thank you. Yeah, I just was wondering whether you had done any kind of comparison of your stage and flow simulated values against observed stage and flow, and also what the proposed flow targets may be from CDFW, and whether you're achieving that level of skill.
So this is Dan Worth from State Water Board. I'm try to answer this, but Al, maybe you could jump in as well. I think the hydrology model helps to model or simulate the amount of water that is moving through the stream channel. Also helps to simulate groundwater levels and surface water groundwater interaction. I think if there's questions about, fish passage or stage elevations from certain flows, I think that hydraulic models are better suited, and so you run these flows from a hydrology model like this through a hydraulic model, and the hydraulic model is better suited to answer some of those types of questions. And Al, if you want to chime in, add anything to that. And I guess I'll just add one more thing. I think CDFW has developed studies to better look at those types of relationships between hydrology and hydraulics. So Al,
Yeah,
you
this
have
is
anything
Al.
to add?
Yeah. That makes sense, Dan. I think the model is focused on getting the flows as opposed to the exact depths through the different riffles and reaches that are important for the fish passage. So in the release of the model in August, there's some presentation of the calibration metrics, some discussion of the model's abilities at low flows. There'll be additional discussion in the documentation report in December. It's coming out in December. I haven't tried to marry those too much with the specific CDFW's requirements. That's something that could be done. The other thing is, using the model and the kind of, there's always going to be some degree of error, uncertainty in the models. But using the models in a comparative manner, like comparing one scenario to another, a lot of those uncertainties are subtracted out to some extent. So that's another thing to keep in mind as the model's being used going forward. But it's definitely something that needs to be considered as we're looking at specific things with respect to CDFW's recommendations.
Bruce, your microphone is unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I was just saying, it seemed like in the mandatory scenarios that you ought to have the CDFW flow recommendations instead of the Matilaha Dam, because Matilaha Dam's not going to come down in the next 5 years, and you will be using the flow recommendations for the next few years for the board to make some kind of decision, I suppose. So it seemed like the Matilaha Dam option ought to be in the optional zone. Not that it shouldn't be run, but it's not as high priority, I think, as the CFW flow recommendations. Otherwise, how would the board evaluate CFW's flow recommendations?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that comment. And yeah, Dan, if there's anything you want to say in response to that.
I think when we identified these four early on in the study planning, it was kind of a question of timing when we would get CDFW flow recommendations in relation to where we were at with developing scenarios. And I think that's why it was left off early on in our study planning, but I do agree that it seems to be an important one. And then I just wanted to add that if we do officially start a flow objective setting process, a rulemaking process, we again are likely to run additional scenarios beyond these 8 that are scoped through this contract currently. So there's likely to be additional scenarios related to balancing flow objectives.
I just wanted to read out loud. Brian Bonney wrote a comment: before committing to using one of the 4 TBD scenarios for other climate change conditions, I suggest seeing the results of the first climate change scenario. It's a good comment. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Any kind of technical questions on like pulling data together, or like the types of files that we're looking for? And maybe while folks are thinking about those, I'll just start our wrap up here. So just as a reminder, we have 2 more deliverables coming in the next 6 months. The first is that we are going to release the draft version of the groundwater surface water model with a model documentation report in December of this year. So just under probably about 6 weeks from now. When I get off this webinar, I will go back to peer reviewing the document. We're dropping the word preliminary from this version of the model. So if you looked at the preliminary draft version of the model that we released in August, this is kind of the next iteration of it. The calibration has improved since even the preliminary version. I think we're into the 90s now on calibration version. Last I heard, that model report will include a user manual. And well, I'll get into more what's some of the other components of that release. And then in spring of next year, we're going to release the draft Ventura Watershed nitrogen transport model and modeling report that is being developed for the Regional Water Board under this project. And the reason these projects are coupled is the groundwater surface water model, and especially the groundwater portion of the groundwater surface water model, is needed to inform that nitrogen transport model. So a little more on the deliverables. So we'll be releasing the draft Ventura River groundwater surface water model report in December. We'll announce it on our State Water Board email list, and I'll also forward that announcement to the Ventura River Watershed Council email list. We'll also send out an email to the Technical Advisory Committee announcing the release. Purpose is to solicit comments on the model and model report and to teach people how to use it. The report will include documentation of the model setup, the representation of water demand that was presented and has been refined since back in the spring. Will include calibration and validation results of the sensitivity analysis. Will include the draft results of the unimpaired flow scenario, which we previously released the preliminary draft version of results of the unimpaired flow scenario. The report will also, I already said that, okay. Oh, so we'll also be releasing a slightly more revised version of the user manual, slightly updated version of the user manual that was released alongside the preliminary draft model in August. So look for this in December. And we're putting this out for a longer than 60-day public comment period. We're very aware that the GSAs are hard at work completing their plans for the Department of Water Resources deadline in January. So we expect the comment period for this groundwater surface water model and model report to run into mid to late February. And we'll, in the public comment period, during the public comment period, we will run a 12-hour training for a couple of purposes. The first purpose of the 12-hour training is a beginning presentation on the model that will be kind of general and intended for the audience like here. So folks that are very familiar with the watershed, but not necessarily all of us are modelers. That'll be probably a few hours. The remainder of this 12-hour training will be a technical training for modelers to learn how to use this model and to help inform, so to help them learn how to use the model in case their organization or they themselves want to use it, but also so that they can provide comments. So we are targeting February 2022 for this model training. When we initially scoped it, it was going to be in person in Ventura area. That was before COVID, so we haven't really figured out whether this will be in person or virtual. But yeah, we want to give modelers and everyone that attends this training sufficient time afterward to learn to use the model and then to provide comments. And so we're targeting February, and you would have at least 2 to 3 weeks after the training to provide comments before the comments would be due. The next deliverable after that is the draft Ventura River nitrogen transport model report that we will also be releasing to solicit comments on. This model report will include all the same model setup, calibration, and validation results. This model report will include all scenario results. So the groundwater surface water model report will only include the unimpaired flow scenario result, because as you can tell, we're still building the other scenarios. But for the nitrogen transport model, we will include all scenario results in the release of this model, as well as training materials. We expect to release this model and model report in spring of next year, announcing it on the same platforms. And the TAC and public comment period for this will be shorter. It will be about 30 days, and we will have a 4-hour technical training that will be basically a follow-up to the technical training that was run for the groundwater surface water model. So if someone is interested in learning how to use this model, providing comments on this nitrogen transport model, we highly recommend participating in the training for the groundwater surface water model, because that will prepare you for the nitrogen transport model. I should just add that these trainings will be, the State Water Board, we are paying for Geosyntec and DPSA to run these trainings. And so we will, they are open to, the technical portions of the trainings are open to any interested modeling staff or modeling persons in the watershed. And depending on the venue, we might be able to open it up even more if someone wants to learn how to use these tools. I shouldn't overpromise. And like I said, the beginning of this 12-hour training will be open and invite to everyone. It'll be general. So finally, yeah, any remaining questions? This is the contact info for some of the water board's project team that work on this. If you haven't yet, please visit our website, InStream Flow Unit website for the Ventura River Watershed. We have lots of documents that we've been publishing over the last few years up there. I should say, yeah, so those are all up there. Thank you for participating. If you want to coordinate on scenarios, please contact us immediately or as early as next week. We can start scheduling meetings to chat and answer your questions on specific data sets we need, data formats, file types, try and answer all your technical questions so that we can build these scenarios. Yeah, so please email your technical comments and any data you can pull together to instreamflows@waterboards.ca.gov by Friday, December 3rd. So yeah, please email any proposals you have for scenarios. If you need more time to pull together data, that's fine, but we do need to see some concrete proposals sooner. The slides and the meeting recording we will be making available probably early next week. This meeting has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube. We will link this meeting on our Ventura River website for the InStream Flow Unit at the State Water Board. We will post the copies of the slides and this chat log to our FTP site, our Ventura River Modeling TAC FTP site, where we posted the spring webinar materials. That TAC website also has the preliminary draft groundwater surface water model and all other deliverables that we've released so far. That the newest versions, we don't have like some of the early drafts from 2017, 2018, those have been taken down, but all other more recent documents are also on that FTP. But we'll also have a link to the meeting recording there too, if you don't find it on our website. To log into the FTP, there's a username and password here. Contact me if you need help logging in or using the FTP. Additionally, you can subscribe to our Water Board's email list at waterboards.resources/email subscriptions. And you have to find divisional water rights and select water action plan, statewide in-stream flows. And that's how we announce everything. But we do forward those announcements to the Ventura River Watershed Council. These links are also in, if you've been forwarded like an email announcement, this should be at the bottom of that email announcement. So finally, thank you all for participating. This has been a really helpful webinar. We got tons of great ideas and questions, really great engagement. That's it. So if anyone wants to stick around and ask technical questions about like file types or formats or things like that, we can stick around till noon. Otherwise, I hope you have a nice day, nice weekend, and hope to be hearing from you soon on some proposals and coordinating on data.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll stick around for a minute or two here and see if anybody has specific questions.
Thank you all for participating.
Okay, no hands raised, no questions in the chat box. Give people another 20 seconds or so.
Hey, Kevin and all, thank you for the great presentation and putting this all together. I did have a question. This is Tony Madrone with Watershed Progressive. I was wondering, what, as far as the proposals go, kind of what, December 3rd is when you want the proposals by, is that correct?
Yeah, we want to see something concrete by then.
Okay, perfect. And then for your RFP, is there an RFP? I'm assuming Regina already has that. I can connect with her on it, but is there a link or a place to see that?
No, I don't think so. I think the short answer is no. But we are available to talk to you if you have more questions about how to package your proposal or what types of data like what data formats we need. We want to help you help us, so let us help you help us. And that goes for everyone else. Like, let us help you help us. So
great. Well, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I'll ping you all directly to find out file types you need and what you want from that, and we'll get a proposal together for you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and I just wanted to reiterate that although we want the proposals by December 3rd, we understand that there will be a lot of questions, and we are more than happy to engage in back and forth to answer those questions at any time. We very much look forward to receiving some actual projects and proposals that we can run through our model. But I know it'll be a process getting from here to that fully formed proposal.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, so we're available between now and then to chat as much as you need help.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
All right, not seeing hands.
Should we go back to reviewing the draft model report, Dan?
Yes, yeah, always other things to do. So yeah, thanks everyone. Really appreciate the participation. Really appreciate the questions and some of the comments and feedback. It was really helpful to hear and really helpful for people to be engaged and participate. So thanks, everyone. We'll call an end to the meeting.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.